When you think about food, do you ever consider the rich history behind it? Food is something that we all need, but people really don't think about too deeply. Today, I will be discussing Japanese food, specifically the history of nigiri sushi. Yes, sushi. The combination of rice, fish, sugar, rice vinegar, and nori is a more recent creation actually, but the concept as well as the ingredients involved in making sushi go way back, and I mean way back in time. To truly learn how this dish came to be, let's hop in a time machine and take a trip to the beginning. That's a little too far. Let's try to stick to the more factual side of things. Enter the Paleolithic era. Paleolithic Japan was originally uninhabited, or maybe it was habited, by some people known as the Ainu, but we won't talk about them right now. Eventually, some ancient hunter-gatherers discovered a nifty land bridge connecting that giant landmass that is Asia to the soon-to-be island of Wa. At least that's what the Chinese would call it. Once the land bridge collapsed, the hunter-gatherers were really stuck on this island. So what did they do? They continued to do what they did, which was hunt and gather. The Paleolithic Japanese would follow plants and animals as they grew or moved to new locations. One of the animals that the early Japanese would hunt very commonly were called Yabesika deer, and they would collect various berries and nuts as well. This lasted from 35,000 to 13,000 BCE. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering why, if at all, I'm even talking about this era, since I mentioned not one of the sushi ingredients. Well, the big point is I did mention something, but it wasn't exactly an ingredient. It was people. Because without a creative mind who will one day combine that rice and fish, do you really have anything to begin with? Around 13,000 BCE, the Paleolithic period of Japan had come to an end, and the Jomon period had begun. Many archaeologists have discovered items from this time frame, such as antler harpoons and wooden canoes. What, of course, does this suggest? This shows the Jomon people had become fishermen. They had learned the technique of going out to sea and harpoon fishing large fish like tuna and large mammals like dolphins. The Jomon had mastered fishing without known trade from other countries. They had also learned how to catch larger quantities of small fish by creating nets. One very important find was bone fish hooks, suggesting the Jomon were beginning to use fishing rods. The Jomon people discovered how to cope with changing seasons as well. They would travel from place to place as the weather changed in order to obtain different types of plants such as tubers and yams. The Jomon had also learned to store food, specifically nuts and acorns. They did this using rope-patterned pottery, which they would store in their pit dwellings, which were their little homes, because they weren't always on the move, and if they weren't on the move, they were settled down with families in kind of these holes in the ground called pit dwellings. The important takeaway, for our case at least, is the emphasis on the marine-based diet in the Jomon era. From this, we can see the first part of sushi coming to life, the fish. This is far too early to consider it sushi, though, despite having fish. The next ingredient on our shopping list would be rice. To see when the Japanese first obtained rice, we must jump to the end of the Jomon period. While there is evidence of some slash-and-burn agriculture, it is nowhere near the scale of farming seen in the Yayoi period. Let's now go back to the future. 400 BCE marks the start of the Yayoi period. This would last until 250 CE. In the Yayoi period, we get our first glimpse at Japanese trade with other countries. In reality, this was really China, and it was through the Korean peninsula to Japan. Korea at the time was not an established nation, while China was. China had dynasties, and at the time, it was the Zhou dynasty, and we see it progress through the Xin, and Han dynasty of China. Although, they made an enormous impact on Japanese culture in this era. Something so drastic that it would actually change the future of Japan forever. They introduced the glue that holds sushi together. And what is this? It's rice. Rice traveled to Japan through three areas in particular. The first two are the Yellow and Sea rivers, which are rather weak influences actually on the movement of rice to Japan. Rice via the Yellow River was traded through the Korean peninsula, as I have actually mentioned a little earlier. And the Z was via sea trade. Next is the Yangtze River, and this has the greatest movement of rice from China to Japan. This was primarily by sea, and it also had some trade go through the Korean peninsula. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the Yayoi, the Japanese had become successful hunter-gatherers, so it seemed like there was no point for rice cultivation. This mindset did eventually change, though, as we reached the part where the Japanese are realizing there's benefits of farming. What exactly were these benefits? Food could be grown wherever they desired, people could stay in a single house for their entire lives, and you could grow it under your own control rather than Mother Nature. Sounds like a really sweet deal to me personally. The spread of rice culture wasn't the only amazing thing to come to Yayoi, Japan. There were also bronze tools, which could be used to farm. We also see a new housing design, which was raised floor houses and temples. The temples were designed specifically to hold more rice. And Japan also had this awesome empress named Pimiko. Unfortunately, China totally had no respect for Japan. They would actually call them wa, which means short or dwarf. It's pretty offensive. Now, disregarding the wa factor, the advancements in technology that China gave them were crazy, and they also taught them a ton about farming. This would continue all the way through the Tomb period and the Yamato kings. So regarding sushi history, things get unique from 250 CE to 710 CE. Our sushi time machine has stopped in this odd phase where the capital is constantly changing its location. This is the time of the Yamato kings. Who are the Yamato kings, you might ask? They are Japanese nobles who felt they had been enlightened by the Chinese scholars and should spread their newly learned Confucian, Buddhist. They just want to spread these ideas to the rest of Japan. But if people didn't want their ideas, you know what they'd do? They'd start a war. Because why not? We have the power, we have the religion, we're right. Let's start a war and take over. The Yamato kings would actually build tombs that were the shapes of giant keyholes. And this gave the first half of the Yamato king period the name Kofun period, or Tomb period. Again, I know what you may be thinking. This is unrelated to sushi. But that is indeed not the case. In the beginning of the Tomb period, it was either the 4th or 5th century, historians aren't 100% sure, but the Chinese introduced rice vinegar to Japan. Rice vinegar will become wildly popular in Japan, and a couple hundreds of years later, it's going to be used in sushi, which is why it's so important to our studies. Besides that, in 710 CE, when the Yamato kings reached Nara, they decided to actually stop going, and this marked the beginning of a new period because they weren't changing this time. And what the Yamato kings would typically do is when their leader would die, they would change the capital to a new location. But for Nara, it was a different story. They decided, let's stay in this one location. Let's really develop it and build power. And that's what started the Nara period. Let's dive a lot deeper into the Nara period because it is insanely important for sushi history. The Nara period lasted from 710 to 794 CE and was the first established permanent capital of Japan. This period was of major importance for us sushi lovers. What was made in the Nara period could be considered the sushi ancestor. What I mean is we see the first attempts in Japan at making sushi. The method used was essentially pickling fish, and it created a product called narizushi. This, however, was not invented by the Japanese. Rather, the practice spread along to Japan from China through trade and commerce in the previous years. The first mention of Japanese narizushi was in 718 CE in 2 sets of laws. I'm about to butcher these names, so I apologize in advance, but these were the Yoritsuryo and the Taiho Ritsuryo, which use sushi as an example of a way to pay taxes. Interestingly, this shows how they would accept narizushi as tax, showing it had value. What made this dish valuable enough that it was worth tax collection? Let's look at the process used to make it. The following 3 ingredients were first collected. You had your rice, your salt, and fish. The rice and salt were combined and then coated around the fish. This rice-coated fish was then left for extended periods of time and compressed under heavy stones. The goal was to allow the rice to ferment, producing lactic acid and pickle the fish underneath. The resulting smell of the fermenting rice and fish has been described as a combination of rice vinegar, fish, and blue cheese. Clearly not a pleasant scent. This process could take up to 2 months to over a year just to produce narizushi. Since the fish was preserved from the fermentation process, it became a very common food among travelers since it could last for long journeys. This type of fish that was primarily used in narizushi was called carp. Unfortunately, this process did make rice inedible and resulted in the rice being thrown away, so wasting rice would be really looked down upon. Clearly, making narizushi was a very time-consuming and costly affair as it wasted a lot of rice. To combat this, we see narizushi makers over the next couple hundred years attempting to modify the dish. This will unfortunately result in our time trip not being able to spend much time in the exciting Heian and Kamakura periods that are up next. However, this does not mean they will be ignored by any means. You know what? In fact, let's give them a little call and see how they're doing. Just a quick side note, we do not have phones, so This is all imaginary what I'm about to do. Ring, 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 ring. Howdy, handmaid. How's it going?
Oh, hi there. Everything is going great. Actually, almost too well. We have great Buddhist morals, awesome leaders, and tons of good food. We love to eat grilled fish with rice and vinegar.
Terrific. So I'm assuming you guys have invented nigiri. I'm finally at this point.
No, unfortunately, I cannot say we have. We've been preoccupied with shifting the capital to Heiankyo and establishing our own written language. This probably wouldn't pique your interest, though. Perhaps you'd like to assist in writing Lotus Sutras for Michinaga.
Not really, but I guess that's cool. I mean, that guy seems kind of weird. He kind of has the same name as this manipulative guy I read in a story called The Tale of Flowering Fortunes.
A tale of what?
Well, on that note, I think I'm going to go give the Genji a call. I believe they might have invented nigiri, but I could be wrong. Alright, so I'm just going to advise real quick. In this next part, I can only do so many voices, and the character I will be voicing is Minamoto Yoritomo. But the only other voice I can really do without stressing out my throat is Kermit the Frog, so I apologize if this offends anybody. Ring, 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 ring.
Hello?
Yo, Yoritomo, I gotta ask, have you guys invented nigiri sushi yet? I'm really just curious. I'm kind of studying it, doing all this stuff.
How dare you ask me such foolish questions? Do you know who I am? I'm Minamoto Yoritomo. I was the brains behind the Genji army who defeated the Taira. I am the shogun leading this land. You have no right to waste my time like this. Do you know how hard it is to basically be the driving force of the Kamakura period?
Yeesh, okay man, okay. I read the tale of the Heike, no need to get a big head about it. I know what you did. Oh my god, he just hung up on me. Alright, so ignoring the fact that one of the most influential figures in Japanese history just hung up on me, let's just jump over to the year 1333. This marks the beginning of the Muromachi Warring States period, which lasts until 1573 CE. Yoritomo shogunate has fallen apart, and various village heads have gained power. They began calling themselves daimyo. As the name Warring States suggests, the new daimyo lords who had began gaining power were all fighting against each other. So what's new regarding sushi, which is what we're here for after all? Here we see narizushi further evolve as traditional methods of fermentation were being altered by the use of vinegarization. It is important to realize that this rice was still fermented for the normal time frame. This led to the fermentation process that was traditionally used actually being replaced by the vinegarization process as it became more useful. Since the process was now different, a new name was only appropriate, and this led to the name Oshizushi. The Warring States involved constant encounters with warring clans, meaning this new idea of Oshizushi probably sped very quickly. But it doesn't just stop there. Jump over to the second half of the Warring States period, the Azushi Momoyama period from 1467 to 1600. We see the new vinegarization method even further developed. This new method involved fermenting the oshizushi through vinegarization for only half the time than was normally done. By doing this, the gross fishy smell was removed. This was called namanare zushi, or half-made sushi. This is a crucial time. We see sushi rapidly changing, significantly more than it has since the Nara period. We also, towards the end, see European traders begin to make a presence in Japan. The Warring States leads us into by far the most important part of the whole sushi making process. What I am of course talking about is the Tokugawa shogunate. Here we go, folks. This is the moment you've been waiting for. The Tokugawa shogunate is the final destination of our sushi-induced adventure. This is because nigiri sushi as we know it today was invented in this period. First, I'll begin with a brief explanation of what the heck's going on during the Tokugawa shogunate. First, the capital had been moved from Heiankyo to an area in Kanto known as Edo. This will become known as modern-day Tokyo. A shogun named Tokugawa Ieyasu had come to power. Under his rule, Japan would begin a period of more peaceful times, actually, after years of many troublesome wars in the Warring State period. They had established a system of social hierarchy, and the system went the following order. Shogun were at the top, then daimyo, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, and this was based off Neo-Confucianism. The farmers were required to pay tax in rice, meaning that rice became a crop which was much more often farmed, and this is beneficial to our sushi history because rice is a key ingredient in making sushi. At the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, Merchants were actually treated the lowest of the low, and this is because they were viewed as people who produced nothing. They gained no respect and had little money at the start of the new era. However, we see this change towards the end. Merchants began to open up shops in which they would sell items such as jewelry, silk, noodles, and last but not least, sushi. No, this was not our modern day sushi. This was still namanare sushi. However, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, as fermented fish could be useful for daimyo on their alternate attendance route. And this is because the shogun would constantly make them walk from their hometowns to Edo. Let's go south, and I mean way south, all the way to Nagasaki. Here, trade with the Dutch had introduced sugar to Japan at the start of the shogunate. Sugar immediately became a hit in Japan, leading to the path merchants took across the island of Kyushu being called the Sugar Road. A large amount of sugar ended up in an area called Isahaya, which was wealthy with rice. This led to the combination of rice and sugar, and this idea would soon travel all the way to Edo. The last and final ingredient in our sushi shopping list was seaweed. While konbu seaweed had been collected for hundreds of years, merchants began to shift their attention to a different type of seaweed. This was nori. Nori was discovered in Edo, growing on rocks and shells around the same time sugar was introduced. Specifically, the nori growing near Asakusa was said to be very delicious, which soon became a pole farming area where nori would frequently get harvested. With nori comes the last ingredient, so let's jump right into the year 1818. A man by the name Hanaya Yohei has just arrived in Edo and immediately started working with the goal in mind to serve sushi without having to let it ferment. In the 1800s, merchants were becoming significantly more impactful, and we're about to see this impact with Yohei. In a text I read a while back called Misui Story, it tells the tale of a low-ranking samurai during the Tokugawa shogunate. We see successful flea markets and buckwheat noodle shops, further showing the success of merchants in this story. In 1824, Yohei released a dish called nigiri sushi. What he had done was combine rice, sugar, and vinegar, and shaped it into a small rice ball, and on top of it was a slice of raw fish. This instantly became a hit. Lines would form in front of Yohei himself, who at the time only sold sushi out of a box that he would carry on his back. It could be made in such little time and taste so amazing. The new method of creating sushi rice made by Yohei was called a revelation in the sushi making process. Nori became added to sushi shortly after. Nigiri sushi became wildly popular and was actually considered food for the poor. It only became more expensive when the Western countries such as the United States discovered it during the Meiji Restoration. Yohei went on to open a restaurant called Yohei Sushi, which remained open in Edo until 1932. With this, I will conclude the video. It was a pleasure to learn so much about sushi, and I hope you got to learn something new. And as always, stay classy.